think, Ms. Paul, you'll perhaps understand that I won't take lessons on caucus management from you.
And
I think what I will keep focused on is making sure that our first woman finance minister has moved forward on child care.
Brothers, as you can hear, quite a spirited debate. I think it might be time for us to jump in with a bit of the commentary, trying to keep us to our original times that we set. Amazing bit of back and forth there from Representative Annemie Paul and Prime Minister Trudeau. So they mentioned, she started going into a bit, Brian, some of the allegations that have been levied against the Liberals and Justin Trudeau regarding some issues around accountability, firing of the AG, the SNC scandal, him calling himself a feminist in 2015, then immediately firing the first female AG at the first opportunity he got and not standing up for her at all. Could we start there? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think you covered off the first couple, because he actually went all the way to an ethics committee on those first two. I don't know if you mentioned the WE scandal that happened last year. Essentially, I mean, in a nutshell, it was a lobbyist scandal, and something like $500 million. It was closer, I think it was actually closer to $750 million was granted to this organization that had paid his family some money, $500,000 in speaking fees and things like that. So since the beginning of his leadership, he's had this issue, and it's hit the debate floor. It's never actually gone anywhere. Obviously, he's still there. His finance minister resigned over a separate scandal, which didn't actually involve him, but involved the party caucus, and he was found. Then before that went to ethics, he just resigned and got repositioned somewhere else in the government. So definitely, this is going to be something that I think the other leaders are going to hit back on him pretty hard on. The SNC Lavalin scandal, where you mentioned he fired that his attorney general, Jody Wilson-Raybould, that one was particularly, challenging for a lot of people, as Annemie Paul just mentioned. His whole, when he came in with a lot of fanfare about how much of a feminist he was, but his female attorney general tried to stop him from interfering with a criminal conviction of a company, SNC Lavalin, who was using bribes and things like that for foreign government officials. And she stepped down from the party, became an independent, and also I believe the other woman that she mentioned also she stepped down and became an independent as well. So it was definitely a big fracture within the Liberal Party. I'm amazed that he called an election so quickly, because it wasn't that long ago that all this went down.
Agreed. That was actually one of the things that seemed like he kind of shocked me when he called the election, because just a lot of the different things that have happened through his prime minister, I guess, term right now is just, like I said, with the SNN Lavalin, it turns out, I mean, these guys helped and funded parts of the Liberal Party. And then when they got challenged by the Attorney General, who, as Brian mentioned, is a woman, but also is part Indigenous. And his whole thing, on top of being a feminist, was that diversity is our strength. He really pushed this idea of multiculturalism. Anybody who knows about the history of Trudeau, the Trudeau family, Pierre Trudeau, his father, actually introduced the Multiculturalism Act in Canada, which helped bring essentially a lot of our parents to this country. Exactly. So they're kind of known as being that group that's progressive and fights for marginalized groups, but they do, when these type of scandals came up, we were like, what what is going on? So definitely have some questions about the Liberal Party and how they're doing things as well. Just different affairs going on with the Liberal Party, not even always Trudeau, but his finance minister. There was a stock sale that happened where he owned a company and sold pretty much $1 million worth of stocks, and then raised the taxes on wealthy investors. So the first thing the Conservatives did was said, wait, you sold these stocks and then you raise the taxes, thus making it others who sell stocks will get taxed more, like you knew you were going to do this. So those raise ethics questions. So when you hear some of these debates and they're going at Trudeau the way they are, there has been evidence, I mean, party aside, of just some questions to have as to what's going on with his party and how they're going to operate it. So it's getting spicy early. That's all I can say.
And if I could, Claude, if I could just piggyback on something you said there, this is, I think, the crux of the whole issue is that, there has been no accountability. Almost every time it's gone to ethics, within the government, Claude's laughing at me, within the government,
no, there's a reason.
The ethics commissioner was appointed by the prime minister. I believe that's how that relationship works. So
absolutely,
it's an independent body, but it's within, the purview of the prime minister.
Exactly.
I'm surprised that we didn't talk about the blackface incident, but I won't let you go there. We're actually going to go back to the debate.
Which one? Which blackface incident? Blackface.
Back to the debate.
The shoe polish. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Blanchette. Mr. Trudeau, I invite you to respond now.
Thank you, Ms. Curl. It's unfortunate to hear the members, the leaders on this stage talking down the incredible work that our Canadian Armed Forces, that our diplomats, that our consular officials did from the beginning of the summer to ensure that as of the very beginning of August, well before this election, we were getting flights out of Afghanistan. We got 3,700 people out of Afghanistan. And over the past weeks, we've been working with the Qataris, for example, on exactly that good news that we've seen of more people, more Canadians getting out of Afghanistan. We work closely with our allies because we know Canadians sacrificed in Afghanistan for a better future. We need to stand by the people who helped us, who helped themselves, and we will with even more people coming to Canada in the coming months.
All right, Mr. Trudeau. Ms. Paul.
As a former diplomat and with a husband who provided advice on the peace negotiations in Afghanistan, we were hearing the stories all the time in the months leading up that this was foreseeable. And so it seems like we got better information on our smartphones than Mr. Trudeau got from our entire intelligence service based on what he's saying. The thing is that when people count on you, when you make a promise to them, then you do it so that people can count on Canada's word. When someone is your partner, you go with them, you go for them, or you don't amount to much. And so leaving behind people in Afghanistan, rocking up to Rideau Hall and calling an election under these circumstances was not the right thing to do. And to borrow a line from Mr. Singh from 2019, Mr. Trudeau could just say, hey, man, I messed up.
All right, Ms. Paul, thank you very much. Thank you all. And now it is our time for a first attempt at open debate. Jumping off of this question, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor have been in Chinese prisons for 1,004 days. The next prime minister has key decisions to make about our already tense relationship with China, such as telecommunications security and foreign investment. Some say this all comes down to a trade-off between Canada's economic growth and recognition of human rights. I'd like to know where you all stand. I'm sure you want to exchange on that. Mr. Singh, per the draw you begin. Leaders, you may jump in.
Thank you very much. We know that we can't imagine what it is for Mr. Spavor and Mr. Kovrig to be going through 1,000+ days in a prison without access to human rights. I can't imagine what their friends and their families are going through right now. All I know is we have to do everything possible to secure the release of these two Canadians. We need to work with our allies, apply pressure, and make sure that we return these Canadians home. That's what we've got to do.
And that's exactly what we've been doing. Over the past 3 years, we have worked with international allies to put pressure on China in every single one of their meetings. We've worked closely with the United States. We, at the G7 a few weeks ago, worked with the international community to make sure we're moving forward on challenging China where necessary in human rights, competing with them economically where we need to, and holding them to account on the rule of law as a global community. And Canada's voice has been very strong on that.
Canada's voice has been absent, Mr. Trudeau. We have not worked with our allies on Huawei. We have not stood up for the 300,000 Canadians in Hong Kong. We've not fought for the two Michaels and put pressure on the communist regime. We have not stood up for human rights. Sir, you did not show up for a vote declaring a genocide towards the Uyghur people. You didn't show up. Canada is the country that was leading the fight against apartheid. We created the UN Human Rights Code. We should be leaders for our values, sir. And you've let the Michaels down, and we have to get serious with China.
If you want to let the Michaels and get the Michaels home, you do not simply lob tomatoes across the Pacific. That is what Mr. Harper tried for a number of years and didn't get anywhere. You need to engage in a sophisticated way with our allies every step of the way.
You have to take
and
the
put
same
that pressure
position on Huawei,
and that's exactly
on
what we
steel,
have done
on
every
right,
step of the
Mr.
time.
Mr. O'Toole.
Cyber security, Mr. Trudeau. We are out of step, and our allies are wondering where Canada's gone. You started as Prime Minister saying you admired China.
If I could, yes?
I'm coming to you, Ms. Paul. Just a second. I want to get to Mr. Singh and then to you, Ms. Paul.
I appreciate, thank you very much, the opportunity. I want to also we're talking about leadership and accountability. And in this pandemic, one of the moments I think of leadership that has been a failure is the fact that when we talk about leadership, it means finding solutions. And in our long-term care homes here in Canada, we saw the worst conditions in the
Mr.
for-profit.
Singh, we're going to have
That was
time to chat with
completely-
that later. The topic is China, human rights and economic growth. To you, Ms. Paul.
Yes, and this is an area where certainly lines are being redrawn all across the world. And the main thing that Canada is going to have going forward in terms of currency is its word. When we make a promise, we have to keep those promises. That's how, when we need help, we get it. You know, my mom grew up on a farm in a small community, and she learned very young and taught us that you have to give your word to your neighbors, and they have to be able to count on it so that when you need help, they're there for you. And so when we don't show up, when we're asked for vaccines from COVAX, and then we take vaccines from COVAX, when the Uyghur ask us for help to declare a genocide and we don't do that, when we don't show up on the climate by setting targets that are ambitious, but at the same time in line with our international partners and do our fair share, then our word doesn't count for much, and then it makes it very hard for us to help people like the Michaels when they need us the most.
Mr. Blanchet, did you want to get in on
Throwing
this?
tomatoes might not be the solution, but I would submit humbly that doing nothing might not be the solution either. The Mr. Trudeau's record on human rights is not perfect. We might name the two Michaels, we might name Uyghur in Xinjiang, we might name Taiwan, Hong Kong, we might name Catalonia and Mr. Puigdemont, we might name the worst of all,
Mr. Blanchet.
Raif Badawi being still held in Saudi Arabia because Canada wants to sell weapon and military supply to Saudi Arabia,
Mr.
which is
Blanchet,
unacceptable.
Mr. Blanchet,
Mr.
The Parliament voted.
Okay,
I will
gentlemen,
finish.
one at a
2
time.
seconds. The Parliament voted unanimously to give citizenship to Raif Badawi. Nothing has been done afterward.
All right.
simply
Whoa, Mr. O'Toole, Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Singh.
Mr. Blanchet is correct. Canada is needed back on the world stage. We may be smaller than China with respect to population and economy, but we are a giant when it comes to our commitments to human rights, to dignity, and to the rule of law. And we have to start working with our allies to take a more serious approach for human rights, standing up for our workers on fair trade, and making sure that our voice is a principled one on the world stage again.
The problem with Mr. O'Toole and his principles is he says all the right-sounding things, and he's working on reassuring everyone that he's right there as a strong leader. But he can't convince his candidates to get vaccinated. He can't convince his MPs to
All
follow
right,
his
let's keep the theme.
pro-choice.
Mr. Singh, you wanted to...
Let me cut back in again. Let's switch the debate a bit. Well, not switch it, but let's follow that line actually about Canada's basically human rights legacy. So we were talking a bit earlier. You guys see you can see my screen, right? Yeah. Headline from earlier this year that was really big in Canada. Over 600 bodies of children found in former residential schools. And so brothers who may not be familiar with these residential schools, they were basically these institutions where Indigenous children were taken to so that they could be, I think that the term that they used was sort of re-educated and brought into Anglo-Saxon Christian community. One of the famous terms that was used at the time was kill the Indian and not the child, or something similar to that effect. But seen from the headlines that it may not have been that may not have been the case. So basically, tremendous uproar in Canada having found these bodies. I think we got to the point where they actually stopped counting because the assumption was we just keep finding more, and rather than bringing up that hurt over and over and over, we'll just stop. So Brian and Claude, maybe turn this topic over to you.
So yeah, again, it does fall in line with the human rights abuse, because often the image that Canada wants to present to the world is one of, you know, we always hear about the friendly Canadians, the super nice Canadians, the Canadians that never, you know, fight or do anything. And the reality of it is, it was still a former colony, and there was still colonial mentalities that existed in Canada, especially if you're looking at like the early 90s, mid 90s. And I mean, even to a certain extent today, you hear about systemic discrimination as it relates to Indigenous people. And so when you're looking at something like the residential schools, I mean, you had religious figures, you had priests or pastors involved in these schools who essentially tried to say, we'll show you, we'll civilize these people, these Indigenous people, again, the mindset of kill the Indian, right? Like, we're going to civilize them, we're going to make them the way Canadians ought to be. And what it did, especially as people from the Afro diaspora, we understand from our own history and heritage, like the idea of, you know, being removed from your heritage and ancestral cultures, coming, you know, we know through our history just what happened to the ancestors, coming here, being taught a language, being told you can't speak this language, you can't practice your religion. Well, a similar thing happened here from that standpoint, priests coming in and saying that, you know, you have to follow our way. And this is on really, when you think about it, their own land, right? This is literally their homelands. This is why we do the land acknowledgements and the treaty, and we acknowledge the treaties as well, and why it's so important to us, because we recognize that this was a part of Canadian history, and it does still have impacts today. You still have Indigenous reserves. Again, these bodies that they found, these are recent. These are not from the 1960s. We're talking about within the year, right? Within the year and late last year, they found these bodies. So, you know, it's just a reminder of the importance of why Canada needs to be held accountable and recognize the human rights abuses that have happened here. So, Pete, go ahead.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is that you have to remember that residential schools weren't just a yesteryear thing. It wasn't like 100 years ago. You know, I mean, sorry, they had residential schools yesteryear. They had them 100 years ago, but I believe the last one was only closed when I was like 7 or 8. And so, and I watched a movie when I was very young called Where the Spirits Live. I believe that's what it's called. And it was basically like a docudrama about what some of these kids went through. And I watched that when I was quite young, and it always impacted me. I lived out west for 4 years, and I had the opportunity to meet some survivors of residential schools. I had a couple buddies who their parents were in residential schools, and you know, it's kind of like talking to a veteran of the Great War or any war, really. It's not easy for them to talk about. You know, you have to remember that it wasn't just the institutionalization, it was also the stripping of culture, the stripping of language, the stripping of religion, the forcing of religion, of new religion. You know, they're deep wounds that I think to this day still need to be attended to.
And that's the part of it, right? Is that the reconciliation piece of it? We need to see more. But Jay, go ahead. We'll go back to the debate.
Oh yeah, thanks, boys. Brian, thanks for sharing a bit of that background and that story there. Yeah, let me pop back into debate. I think we may have missed a bit of question and answer from the public, but let's pick up with what's happening there.
I'm turning it back to the leaders. It is time for more debate. The draw has Mr. Trudeau and Mr. O'Toole facing off. Your topic is climate change. Even today, 1 in 4 Canadians don't believe that climate change is caused by human activity. How can we achieve real progress when so many people are still debating the fundamentals? Mr. O'Toole, you begin.
Climate change is a real threat, not only to Canada and to the world. That's why we have to take a serious plan to tackle it. That's why, as I said, we put our plan out in April, because we had to restore some trust on this issue to make sure we can show Canadians we can get emissions down and get the economy working again. That is key. We have a plan to meet our Paris targets, but minimize the impact on jobs and investment. We're also going to make major investments in electric vehicles, in the hydrogen economy, small modular reactors. There is so much we can do to get our emissions down, but grow a strong economy, because without a strong economy, we can't tackle climate change. We can't tackle the issues of today.
The reality that Mr. O'Toole has never understood is you can't have a strong economy unless you tackle climate change. And you ask about how we're going to convince the quarter of Canadians who still don't think climate change is real. Well, Mr. O'Toole can't even convince his party that climate change is real, because they voted against that. And that's perhaps why his plan is so weak. His plan is to go back to the Harper targets, to the Harper approach on fighting climate change, which doesn't work. His costed platform, which he just put out last night, cuts $2 billion from climate investments and from things. And for our friends in BC,
you have never made a target,
has proposed to restore
let him respond, Mr. Trudeau. Mr. Trudeau, let Mr. O'Toole respond to you, Mr. O'Toole.
Thank you, Ms. Curl.
The tanker ban.
Mr. Trudeau always forgets one fact. He has never made a target for climate change. He has great ambition. That's part of the reason we're in an election in a pandemic, is his ambition. He doesn't have achievement. Well, he never meets his targets. So we have a plan
in 2030,
that we will meet the
quite
targets
difficult
and
to
get
meet
our
a target
country
that's 9
back
years
to
away,
work.
except for the fact that right now we are on track
Gentlemen,
to beat
we
that
have
target.
to wrap
Never
this
made a
segment.
target, Mr. Trudeau.
Over
All
that
right,
target.
we are moving
We are
on.
track.
We are moving on, leaders. Next up is Mr. Singh, Mr. Blanchette, and Ms. Paul. I'd like each of you to describe how you'll implement a national approach that best recognizes the significant regional differences involved in fighting climate change. You begin, Mr. Singh. You may jump in one at a time, please.
Of course.
Well, here's the thing. We just heard Mr. O'Toole and Mr. Trudeau argue about who's worse. And honestly, it's a tough question to answer. Let me tell you, you're not stuck with these two. Better is possible. We can invest in a clean economy. We can end fossil fuel subsidies. We can make sure we're creating clean transportation, and we can invest in provinces and territories to make sure they have the resources necessary to fight the climate crisis. I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic. I'm going to be a dad soon, and I want to make sure my child grows up into a future that has the same opportunities that I had, that has clean air, clean water, a clean place to live. I want to make sure that that's
as far as I understand it, it is not a national or even less a regional issue. It is a planetary issue. And it has to be tackled by everybody at once. But I would be glad to give some of my precious time to Mr. O'Toole, because a week ago, a little more than that, he said in French that he did not want anymore to have a pipeline to go through Quebec. That was quite a statement. He said that in French, no more pipeline through Quebec. I want to hear that in English tonight. Please, please.
Well, Mr.
Hold on. This segment is...
I'll take time.
Quite frankly, this...
We're not going to let that happen.
This on the climate, this sort of approach is going to get us nowhere, and a global issue. This is a national issue. This is a nonpartisan issue, and we have got to be able to come together across party lines. I said that I was available for a debate just on the climate because it's that important, but we've invited many times all of the parties to join us in a joint cabinet, a cross-party cabinet, to deal with this the way that we dealt with the pandemic, together. People were so inspired to see these leaders come together in the early days of the pandemic. We have got to bring that same approach here. Let's come together, because that's what's needed.
Thank you very much. I absolutely agree. We do need to come together. I can lay out what we shouldn't do and what we need to do. What we shouldn't do is what Mr. Trudeau did. Set targets and miss them. We shouldn't promise to end fossil fuel subsidies and then increase them. We shouldn't put a price on pollution and then exempt the biggest polluters. What we need to do is end those fossil fuel subsidies, invest in provinces and territories with infrastructure that's going to help us
with the greatest of respect to Ms. Paul. Hold on, Mr. Singh. With the greatest of respect to...
Let Ms. Paul respond.
With the greatest of respect to Mr. Singh, we have been making this invitation for years, and it has never been accepted by the NDP or any other party.
All right, we have to wrap this section now, leaders.
Brothers, thank you for staying with us. So we heard a lot there about climate change, about energy. We know energy production in Canada is really big. Brian you are out west, oil sands and oil production very big. But also, I think one of the bigger issues that I keep hearing that comes up is the pipeline that runs through Quebec. And Quebec being sort of a standout province, at least in terms of what's typically expected of Canadian provinces. So Brian, I actually got this quote from you. Quebec is the Texas of Canada. Actually, full disclosure, we started this conversation because I said Quebec is the Mexico of Canada because Canadians basically don't think that it's a part of it, but it's a really important part of the country. But Brian corrected me and told me that it's actually the Texas of Canada because it's constantly trying to leave. But Brian, I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, that's funny. You actually put it on the slide. This was an informal conversation. It was an aside, but you know, Jay's really good at capturing the moment. Yeah, so I've lived in both Quebec and in Alberta, and I would say that those are like our Texas states, our Texas provinces. If you had to think of states, you know, that they would be analogous to. So I actually have to start with pointing out that so the guy with the really the heavy French accent, Yves-François Blanchet, he's the leader of a party called the Bloc Québécois. And I'm not going to get into like a boring constitutional lecture about this, but essentially they have guaranteed power in parliament every election. And I mean, they're a federal party, but the only people who actually vote for them live in Quebec because their entire existence is to promote Quebec rights, Quebec sovereignty. You know, in my lifetime, I lived through one of the referendums, and so there's been 2 referendums on actually, you know, the Quebecers voting on whether or not they want to leave Canada, and that's something that I've heard. You know, I lived out there for 3 years, and my first roommate was actually a pro-separatist guy, and we sat down with lots of conversation about this. If you wander around long enough, maybe not in Montreal, but if you wander around the province long enough, you'll meet people that have this view. And so why is that important? That pipeline that they keep talking about, I mean, I don't know how long this debate's been going on for, but you know, essentially all the oil companies want to put a pipeline that goes all the way out to the coast. They've got one that goes out to the west coast, but they want that one that goes out to the east coast. And the idea is it's going to bring down costs. It's going to move more, you know, move more product to market faster on the Atlantic side. But Quebec has always said no. And, you know, when dealing with Quebec, you always have to remember that everything could become a referendum issue. You know, that's why I say they're like Texas. It's like, well, if we don't get enough what we want, we may just leave and take our tax money with us. They're the second largest province in the country, so it would be kind of a big deal. But yeah, I mean, Claude and I would have grown up and seen a lot of that before I was born. So this is going back probably about 50 years, Claude, 50 years.
Yeah.
There was actually a state of emergency called in the province of Quebec. The War Measures Act was enacted, and there were tanks rolling in the streets. There was, you know, great what you would call today domestic terrorist activity. I think 4 people got charged with murder. Politician, one of the MPs, got kidnapped, thrown into the trunk of a car. It was quite unbelievable, and most of that revolved around the language issue, or a lot of that revolved around the language and culture issue. And you heard Anime Paul and Mr. Blanchet kind of go back and forth at the beginning there a little bit, talking about, you know, or sorry, it was the moderator was talking a little bit about, you know, your policies are discriminatory to other minorities, and this is the part of this that always always gets my head twisted up a little bit, is that they see themselves as the minority. That's essentially what it is. So Canada is a very large country. Majority of it's English. There are Francophones that live outside of Quebec. I've met some Franco-Ontarians, some Franco-Albertans, some Franco-Manitobans, big Manitoba population that speaks French. And they all have different issues, but essentially they just feel that, you know, since it's one of the founding languages of the country, and you know, Upper Canada was the English side and Lower Canada was the French side, essentially Quebec. And since Confederation, this has been an ongoing issue. So they tried to remedy this. So a couple of times they amended the Constitution. They gave them some seats in Parliament, and that's why he's at the federal debate. You've got parties that are tracking ahead of them that don't get invited. So very interesting, this sea of candidates here. See?
Yeah, and just to throw on a little bit, not to cut in too much, but you heard in the beginning the concept of a distinct society. So, and when they were kind of going back and forth, because Quebec's status with Canada has been, again, a topic of debate, being that they are the minority language. But when you think about the size of Quebec and the influence of the French in Canada, like Brian had mentioned, there's Acadia, they have a link to Louisiana, right? The French from there went to Louisiana. So, I mean, there's French all over the country. And Acadia is New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. But Quebec is kind of like the heart, and they even identify themselves separately from sometimes even other French in the country. They'll say, we're not Franco-Ontario, we're Quebec, where Quebec was. And they see themselves as distinct because what they didn't want, even though they will acknowledge the minority situation, like we're being treated like minority, they don't want to be classified as minorities. They're distinct, they operate under different influences. For example, they go off of a civil law, whereas the rest of the country goes off of a common law. There's regulatory requirements in terms of education as to how much French has to be in schools, how much French has to be played on the radio. Signs, I was making this joke with Brian the other day because I've been to France before. We learned French here. And so we went on an exchange trip to France, and the French signs, if you look at a stop sign, it says stop in France. In Quebec, it says arrête, which is the French version of stop. That's how serious it is. Like even something that is English, they will convert it to French just so they can say we have this French identity. So, so probably in the beginning, and then when you heard with the discrimination, I'm sure there's response. People are like, "What the heck?" That's not unusual to me and Brian because of how they're like, "Yeah, okay, we get it. You might think it's discriminatory or whatever, but Quebec comes first, and how we do things and the way we want to do things is fine." So if you see it as discriminatory, too bad. So
For the culture.
for the culture, exactly. Yes, brother, for the culture.
And that I believe the issue that the moderator was pressing him on was about the banning of religious wear. Yeah. So in federal building, if you work for the federal government, or if you work for the provincial government, excuse me, you can't have any religious symbols. So no hijab, no crucifixes, no. I mean, it's all basically banned, which is funny to me because there's a big crucifix that hangs over the legislature.
So this is Bill C-21, which was introduced, I think, a few years ago, maybe 2 years ago, but passed in recent months.
Yeah, Bill 21. So that.
And maybe just before we head back to the debate, good opportunity to also speak about some of the other issues that generally come up around discrimination, and that's usually around gender. And we know in Canada, gender equity is something that's very important to us. And we saw sort of the rise of Jordan Peterson. I know, Claude, you had a bit to say about this, about sort of his, the way that he pushed back against changes to federal code, which would have made it a federal crime, as he put it, to not call someone by their preferred pronouns. But I'll turn it over to you, Claude.
Right. So I'll just go really quickly into that. I mean, you heard a bit at the beginning of the debate about, you know, Trudeau being a feminist and what his, you know, his party did in terms of representation of women. So gender equality is very big. It's a very big topic in this country. The concept of, you know, having equal representation or showing equal representation, but also there's gender fluidity, which is becoming another thing as it relates to pronouns and trans identities and so on and so forth. So one of the things that the government of Canada had done was, and I'm sure it's in the United States as well, the him, pronoun he, him, she, her, and then they, them. I've seen it in my work all over where people start to say, this is my pronoun, they, them. It was regulated that he must call someone who identifies as a they, them, using that pronoun. And his argument was not so much that he had it, well, at first it was like, I'm not going to do that. No one can regulate me to do that. So there was an uproar about that. But his whole thing when he explained it was that I don't believe the government should be able to regulate my speech and force me to call someone a pronoun. If they ask me to call them that pronoun, I will do that. And said he's never refused anyone who has said, call me by my pronoun, they, them, he, him, she, her. But if the government is forcing me to do it, then I have a problem with that. Again, that's going back to this idea of gender equality. But again, Canada, we do know, if you live here, you know there's regulations, like we were just talking about in Quebec, there's regulations over there. So that kind of balance is something that we've had to address in this country. And sometimes certain individuals, especially during sitting with the professor at U of T, they get vocal about it. So.
Thanks, Claude, for explaining that. But Brian, did you want to jump in before we head back to the debate?
Yeah, when Claude was speaking, it just kind of, the dots just connected in my head. They've been doing that in Quebec forever with the French language mandate. I didn't even realize that, but that's essentially the kind of thing that he's pushing back against. It's not, so there are words that we cannot say, right? There's things that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. There's certain things you cannot say. His argument is that the government cannot mandate what we must say. And so I just realized that the French language mandate is exactly that. If I have an Italian restaurant and I want an authentic Italian menu, and this actually happened, they fined the restaurant owner like tens of thousands of dollars because his menu was in Italian. They said that you can have Italian on the menu, but it has to be in French first, and the French letters, there's a certain percentage bigger that the French letters have to be than everything else. It's very you get used to it. Like I was living there for 3 years, you get used to it after a while, but at first it's very hard to wrap your head around, especially because most people in Montreal speak English.
That would be different. But let's head back to the debate.
Ms. Paul, Mr. Singh, Mr. Trudeau, you're up. Tell me, what is your plan to end the ongoing disproportionate violence against Indigenous women and girls? Ms. Paul.
The first thing is to make space for Indigenous leadership because, we have done all these things and made all these promises. We know what needs to be done. The recommendations are there in the calls for justice and the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls report, and yet we still don't have the action. And so, as I said before, it should be Jody up here answering that question. It should be Mumala Kakak up here answering that question. We need to make the space for Indigenous leadership to guide this process, and above all, we need to make this a priority. All that is left now is political will.
But that is exactly what we have been doing, Ms. Paul. When we called the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls after years of governments avoiding doing that, we ensured that we brought the truth forward. And then we worked with Indigenous leaders groups, Indigenous women's groups to co-develop the action plan that we are now fully funding so we can get justice for the victims, healing for the families, and put an end to this ongoing national tragedy. It will take a lot of work by all of us, but we are walking this road in partnership because we know it needs to be done and there is much more to do.
But Mr. Trudeau, sadly, and this, I don't take any pleasure in this, the calls to justice are out there and you haven't acted on them. And I meant it when I said you can't take a knee one day if you're going to take Indigenous kids to court the next. That's not leadership.
Mr. Singh,
that's
you
not gonna
love
make things
that
better.
line about taking Indigenous kids to court. It's actually not true. We have committed to compensating those kids who went through that.
Listen,
and what's
seriously,
more
you can't
than
say
that,
that.
this is important, Mr. Singh.
No, you can't say you're not taking them to court when you're taking them to court.
When you talk
there
about
are kids out there that are being fought by you in court.
Leaders, I would actually remind you the question is about violence against Indigenous women and girls. Let me recenter you on that.
I appreciate it because he can't continue to say that. That
Well,
doesn't make any sense.
And Ms. Curl, I will say again, I said this last night in the French debate, this is why we need more diversity in politics. This is why we need people to be, who are most directly impacted by issues, to be able to speak for themselves, because we are drifting off into things. We have only dedicated 2 minutes to talking about how we are going to bring true justice to Indigenous women in this country, if we can
Ms.
stick
Curl.
to the
All right,
topic.
Mr.
Ms.
Trudeau.
Curl, on this topic, and it was brought up in the earlier one, and we talked about Indigenous women, I want to talk about those kids buried in unmarked graves across the country, because it was a tragedy for all Canadians, one long known by Indigenous peoples. But when I went to Cowessess to speak with Chief Casmus Delorme, we not only grieved those kids, we signed an agreement, a landmark agreement, to keep kids at risk in their communities, to take them out of the provincial system. That is how we move forward. It took years to sign that agreement, but we got it, and we are empowering Indigenous communities
Mr.
to
Trudeau,
care for
we're
their
out
own
of
kids.
time. Mr. Singh, I'm going to give you very brief moment to respond. Briefly, we're over time.
We need to implement all the calls to justice. We need to listen to Indigenous women and girls. We need to make sure that they're safe, and we have the steps that they've laid out that we need to follow.
All right, thank you very much, leaders. Now I'm really pleased to welcome Melissa Ridgen of APTN News. Melissa is going to be asking you each a direct question on our theme of reconciliation. Your first question, hi Melissa, is to Mr. Blanchette. Over to you.
Tanshe, thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be here with you to ask some questions for our APTN audience. Mr. Blanchette, I'm going to start with you. You know, numerous government reports, including in Quebec, have sounded the alarm that systemic racism exists, from Joyce Echequan dying as she's taunted by hospital staff, to policing, the justice system. What will you do as Black leader to address systemic racism in your own province, in Quebec, and also elsewhere in Canada?
First, never underestimate the weight, the sadness of those dramas. Second, I acknowledge, I recognize the existence of systemic racism in June 2020. And then, what happened? It became a political tool against Quebec. It became a tool to say Quebec is this and that and racist and xenophobic and all of that, instead of opening a discussion, trying to find solution, consulting experts, discussing with the First Nations themselves. It became this white society against this other one, white society. We build nothing, so the words became toxic. I'm
What are you
absolutely
going to do? Where
open
do
to
we
the
go from
idea
here, then?
of discussing all of that on a quiet stage without this aggressivity, being aggressive as this debate has become.
All right, Mr. Blanchette, we have to move on. Your next question, Melissa.
This question's for you, Ms. Paul. You know, Canada has more children in government custody right now than at the height of residential schools. New legislation, child welfare legislation, actually takes the onus on and puts it on the First Nations communities to bring their kids back, cleaning up the mess that Canada has created, essentially. And those children are going to have to be brought back to all of those same problems that still exist, that were the grounds for apprehension. What would you do in the House of Commons to make sure that poverty and trauma issues are addressed?
Thank you very much for that question, and absolutely, we mentioned that not that long ago in one of our statements that the residential school system had been replaced by children in care, and that this was just perpetuating the legacy of trauma. It really comes back to what I said before, which is that the Indigenous leadership is there. It is ready to guide all of these processes. We have all of the recommendations we need. What we are missing is political will. What we are missing is those who have been in power for a very long time, making space for new voices and diverse voices. I actually had to pull my jaw up, which just dropped, when I heard what Mr. Blanchette said. I invited Mr. Blanchette to get educated about systemic discrimination. I extend that invitation again. I would be happy to educate him.
It's nice to want to educate
This
me.
is my time, sir.
It is.
Thank you.
So nice time to insult people.
That was not an insult. It was an invitation to educate yourself.
This is leader direct questions.
There
Melissa,
should be
Mr.
some decency in this debate.
I
Since I'm many minutes behind everybody else, there should be some
Mr. Blanchet,
decency
you
in
have
the
had
debate.
every opportunity to
It's
jump
your
in an open
responsibility,
debate.
not mine, but some things
And
cannot
I am
be said.
fulfilling my responsibility, sir. Melissa, we're going to keep moving on.
Is
Your
it my
next
turn?
It is your turn.
Thank you. Mr. Trudeau, this is for you. You know, your Liberal government has turned Indian affairs into two separate, massive bureaucracies that eat up large portions of funding that will never see it on to reserve. It doesn't leave the bureaucracy. You know, you've promised clean drinking water, but billions of dollars later, that's not happened. Many still do not have clean drinking water. You know, Canadians and Indigenous people are losing patience with the lack of results from all of this spending. So I guess the question is, why would they believe you a third term, that they would get results and you would be accountable for all that spending?
One of the enemies of progressive politics, Melissa, is cynicism. Is discounting the hard work that millions of people have been involved in over the past years. And yes, there's always more to do. Progressives always know there's more to do. But when we came into office, there were 105 long-term boil water advisories. We lifted 109 of them, and for each of the ones that are remaining, we have a project lead, a project team, and an action plan, and we're going to lift those all. There are tens of thousands of kids across this country, Indigenous kids, who've started the school year in new schools or refurbished schools. We have moved forward on settling more agreements and more land claims and more partnerships than any other government over the years. We continue to work in partnership and respect and invest more money in Indigenous communities than any previous government. And no, we're not done yet. We have more to do.
I think the money, I don't think anybody's questioning the money spent. I think that they're questioning the results for the money that's spent. My next question is to you, Mr. Singh. You know, federal forces, including the RCMP and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, have been used throughout Canada's history to prevent First Nations from exercising their treaty rights to fish and to hunt and to defend land and water. This is happening right now on both coasts, including under the NDP party in British Columbia with regards to fishing and logging. So my question would be to you, as Prime Minister, what would you do to ensure Indigenous rights and title are finally respected in this country?
I really appreciate the question. First of all, we need to respect Indigenous treaty land and rights. That's a fundamental step towards walking the path of reconciliation in a real meaningful way. But you mentioned the RCMP, and I got to talk about the really sad reality that there's been violence, heavy-handed violence, against Indigenous communities, against peaceful protesters, and I have long called for reform of policing. When I was in the provincial level, I fought against carting. I've continued to use every platform I have to say, we've got to stop the use of force, we've got to overview it, we've got to change the RCMP's mandate, and that's something we can do at the federal level. That's something that Mr. Trudeau said he would do and yet has yet to do, and it's something I'm committed to making sure happens.
Brothers, let me jump in on that issue of reconciliation. Another headline from earlier this year, RCMP commissioner does not recognize the systemic racism in her organization. So this headline came from an interview that the RCMP commissioner did last year, I think in June 2020. And, you know, I think that the headline echoes basically the length and breadth of the interviews, basically her dodging the question of whether or not there's really systemic racism. I would have been okay. I would have felt better if she had just said no, personally, that there's no systemic racism, rather than just sort of going around and around and around. But Claude, let me turn it over to you. So I know, so sort of there's a lot of issues in the community with police brutality and with you know, stopping and searching, and also with the way that police have been treating persons with mental health disorders. One recent story that broke last year was a lady that supposedly threw herself off of a 9th-story balcony while she was in police custody. So let me let you jump in on the issue of reconciliation with the police.
Right. And yeah, it was interesting the debate went that way. We kind of figured that was something they would have to talk about because of just what's been going on with, again, the residential schools and, of course, with George Floyd in the States. Rest in peace to him. So yeah, with Canada, basically, I mean, you know, once again, the image that's presented is, and we hear it here, we're not like those Americans. We're not like them. They got way more issues than we do or whatever. And you sometimes find that in the dialogue of our leadership. So for example, what Jay was talking about with the RCMP leader, she was asked directly, do you believe there is systemic racism in the RCMP? And the way she responded was, I don't know that I can provide you a definition of what systemic racism is for the RCMP. You know, it's almost like I'd rather she had said either, no, I don't think so, or I don't know, but it was kind of like this cover up, like, I don't even know if we can really talk about that. I don't even know if we can really address that. And then in other, even provincially, the provincial leader for us, RPM, basically had said that, yeah, we have some systemic racism, but it's not as bad as the States. And then in Alberta, they had said, no, we don't have systemic racism. So there's always been this kind of thing. As it relates to, you know, research and numbers and stats, what's been coming out from the Human Rights Commission, the Ontario Human Rights Commission and other ones, is that they find that when it comes to police, the use of force, shootings and kind of just aggressive behavior, they're finding that proportionally, so not numbers, right? Because obviously there's more whites in Canada than there are minorities, but proportionally they're finding that Indigenous and Black people are proportionally like more likely to get shot by the police or, you know, get aggressive sentencing. So you kind of heard what Jagmeet Singh had said about, you can't say reconciliation on one side, but then be bringing in like Indigenous kids to court, right? It's kind of that mindset of when you look at criminal figures and who's getting charged and like even incarceration rates for the Indigenous are the highest in the country. And they are one of the smallest population groups, then followed by, I believe it's Black people is followed next as the next set. So when they look at it, they say these proportionally don't measure up. And then there's a question about, is this have to do with a systemic issue, a bias issue? Are we, you know, being too punitive for minorities or Indigenous people who commit crimes versus their white counterparts? Are the police more likely to be aggressive? And again, we're constantly having this back and forth, community activists, community leaders, of course, knowing the community, having the discussions. I mean, even some of us personally, we know brothers or have been in situations with police where the response was very aggressive compared to how I've heard similar responses in some of my white coworkers or friends who happen to be white. And so this is kind of a topic as well here. So it goes to show, one, it's not just an American issue, which sometimes we like to portray it as, but two, that it's something very serious. And if they're serious about reconciliation, they do need to talk about this and address this. So I'll pass it over to my host, Lee.
Oh, I don't believe anything a politician says about systemic racism. I saw that clip that Claude is talking about, and it was like the true politician's answer. She said probably like it was a 500-word essay, and at the end of it, she still hadn't answered whether or not there's systemic racism in the RCMP. I'm like Claude, I would rather she just said no, I don't think so. Next question, because at least you know where she stands. There's no reason that a high-ranking official at that level doesn't know what the issues are and doesn't know how to speak to them intelligently.
Oh, absolutely. I think also, so even me, I've only been here for a few years, but I can think of at least a half a dozen times where I've heard of, you know, RCMP dragging Indigenous people into the woods and leaving them there overnight and then finding their bodies days later. I mean, that happened in Quebec like last year or something like that, you know. So to say that there isn't a system that allows for that level of behavior to continue for decades, it's a little ridiculous. Brothers, do you want to pick up on anything else before we head back to the debate for the last time before we wrap up? I think we had just one question from Brother Stovall in the chat about the Indigenous people being able to fish. So I know that there were some issues around Indigenous land rights. So especially in Nova Scotia, I don't know if anyone is aware of sort of what was happening in Nova Scotia with Indigenous fishing rights. So Indigenous people have access to a certain percentage of the coastal area so that they can fish, as is their right. And apparently they have been using that right to do some lobster fishing during a time when Canada was not allowing its fishermen to do lobster fishing. But of course, the Indigenous nations, being independent, allowed for their, certainly just much less fishermen to go out and do that type of fishing. It ended up being that their headquarters were burnt down and some people were attacked, and massive uproar that sort of came out of it. Brian, did you want to touch on that before we head back to the debate?
No, man, I think you covered it beautifully there. Which province did you say that was?
This was Nova Scotia.
Okay. I think they have some similar issues on the west coast, the British Columbia coast, but like further north, I have to do some digging on that.
Okay, we'll head back to the debate. We were getting some questions in from the public.
My question is this: at my age, I never imagined that I would have to keep on working, but I have to afford to live where I do. So I'd like to know, when they become Prime Minister, what will they do to help us seniors survive?
Thank you, Janet. Leaders, you've heard Janet's question. We're starting with you, Mr. Blanchette.
Merci, Madame. For many months now, the Bloc Québécois has demanded for the government to increase the amount of money being provided on a monthly basis to our elders. It's nowhere in the Conservatives program, and in the Liberals program, it starts at 75, nothing below 75 for this pension. I'm not sure about the word in English. It has to be done. Those people are those who suffered the most from the pandemic. Their power to buy things was reduced. The fact that they were alone more than ever before was made worse. And the stress, the anxiety they lived with is terrible. We want something to be done, and it has to start with a monthly check, seriously increased.
Thank you, Mr. Blanchette. Mr. O'Toole.
Thank you, Ms. Valla, for the question. This is a crisis facing our country, affordability, and it's hitting our seniors the hardest. That's why in Canada's recovery plan, our plan to give you a break, we're going to double the Canada Workers Benefit. There are many seniors like you having to work to keep up with the cost of living. We're going to double that for you to give you a break. We're going to get bills down for internet, for cellular phone. We're going to get grocery bills down. That is our plan and our commitment. And in December, we're going to give you a break with the GST holiday and help bricks and mortar stores in the process. Mr. Trudeau is borrowing every day $424 million, and he's causing an inflation crisis. We have to secure our future, and that's our commitment to you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. Mr. Trudeau.
Ms. Fallish, thank you so much for your question. We know that seniors have been deeply affected by this pandemic, the isolation, the extra costs, which is why we stepped up with a one-time support so you could help get through this pandemic. But we need longer-term supports. One of the first things we did was increase the guaranteed income supplement for our most vulnerable single seniors when we first got elected. We're doing that again in our proposal in this election. We're also moving forward with increasing the OAS for all seniors over 75, because we recognize that the costs continue to increase as you get older and continue to want to live at home. We're giving you more supports so you can stay at home safely and make those renovations. Importantly, we will continue to have your backs as we have through this pandemic and into the future.
Thank you, Mr. Trudeau. Mr. Singh.
I want to thank you so much for your question. And one of the things that you mentioned is that you didn't think you would have to keep on working. And I don't think our seniors should have to work. If seniors want to contribute by working, that's absolutely their right. But you shouldn't have had to work. And in a country as rich as ours, we should make sure our seniors are able to retire with dignity, that you've got the supports necessary to live a life of dignity. So what we're proposing to do is put in place a guaranteed income for seniors so they can live with dignity and not have to worry about paying the bills. That's a starting point. What we've seen so far is that Mr. Trudeau and Mr. O'Toole both are going to either cut the help that you receive or put the burden back on people like you. We believe that the ultra-rich should pay their fair share for once and invest in you, invest in families, invest in people.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. Ms. Paul.
Thank you very, very much for the question. And as someone who comes from a family where my grandma and grandfather had to work until actually they were kicked out of working because they needed to keep working to afford the basics, I completely understand what you're saying. And this is an opportunity for us to learn the lessons from this pandemic and to really get to the heart of things and to stop talking about the symptoms, but get to the root causes. We need to have, absolutely, and it's so wonderful to see the consensus building around a guaranteed livable income so that whatever your circumstances, you can live with dignity. We need universal long-term care. That's a huge expense. It was for my family. And we need more affordable housing. Let's get to the root causes.
First of all, I want to thank everyone for sticking with us throughout the debate. I see that we're a bit past our time. We wanted to wrap up at 10, but we're running about 20 minutes behind time. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us here this evening. It was an amazing conversation. To our host and co-host, Brian Whitaker, Claude Ologbala, thank you very much for leading the conversation and sharing your experiences and you know, just informing the brothers of what life is like here in Canada.